The encounter. Officer John Matthews drove slowly through the quiet suburban streets, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the evening darkness. The familiar houses with their neatly trimmed lawns passed by as he completed his regular route, a routine he had become accustomed to over the years. The cool night air carried a gentle breeze, rustling through the trees that lined the sidewalks. Streetlights cast warm pools of yellow light at regular intervals, creating a peaceful atmosphere in the residential neighborhood. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light turned red. John eased his foot onto the brake, bringing the patrol car to a smooth stop. He glanced around, his years of police work having trained him to always be observant. That's when he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Under the glow of a nearby streetlight sat a small figure on the curb, a young black boy, no more than 8 years old, with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. Even from a distance, John could see the child's shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The sight immediately set off alarm bells in John's mind. No child should be out alone at this hour. The traffic light changed to green, but instead of continuing straight, he carefully pulled his patrol car to the curb, about 20 feet away from where the boy sat. He didn't want to startle the child by parking too close. Turning off the engine, he left the vehicle's emergency lights on to ensure other drivers could see them. Stepping out of the car, John noticed the boy flinch at the sound of the door opening, his tear-stained face reflecting momentary panic. Just as quickly, the boy turned away, using his sleeve to hastily wipe at his cheeks. John noticed how the child's arms tightened around something he was holding against his chest, though he couldn't make out what it was in the dim light. "Hey there," John called out softly, keeping his voice warm and friendly. "I'm Officer John Matthews. Are you okay?" The boy's head snapped up, and John could see the fear in his wide eyes. But instead of answering, the boy turned his gaze back to the ground, his fingers tightening around the object he clutched protectively. Maintaining a safe distance, John crouched down to the boy's eye level, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The cool, concrete sidewalk was barely noticeable beneath his knee as he focused entirely on the distressed child before him. "It's pretty late to be out here by yourself," John said gently. "I just want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me what's wrong?" Silence hung heavily between them, the boy's eyes still fixed on the ground. John's heart ached for him, sensing the turmoil within. "You know, part of my job is helping people who might be having a tough time," he continued, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. "And it seems like you might be having a pretty rough night. Would you like to go somewhere safer where we can figure this out together?" The boy's shoulders tensed, his internal struggle evident. John could see the desire for help warring with the instinct to stay guarded. After several long moments, John slowly extended his hand, hoping to bridge the gap between them. "What do you say? Will you let me help you?" The boy glanced at the offered hand, and then up at John's face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding only genuine concern in the officer's expression, he finally reached out with one trembling hand, keeping the other tightly wrapped around the object pressed against his chest. "Good choice," John said softly, helping him up gently. Together, they walked to the patrol car. As John opened the back door, he watched the boy climb inside, still clutching the mysterious object. "You're safe now," he assured him as he closed the door. As he walked around to the driver's side, he couldn't help but glance back at the boy. The child sat hunched over, staring out into the night, his fingers still wrapped protectively around whatever he held. The patrol car idled quietly, the engine providing a gentle hum that filled the silence. John pulled over a few blocks from his home, wanting to understand the situation better before making any decisions. In the back seat, Caleb sat with his attention fixed on something in his hands, a photograph that he gripped so tightly his knuckles showed white against his dark skin. John shifted in his seat to face the boy better. "I know this might be scary, but I want you to know you're safe here," he said softly. "I'm Officer John Matthews, but you can just call me Officer John if you'd like." The boy remained silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the photo. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he responded, "My name is Caleb." "It's nice to meet you, Caleb," John said warmly. "Can you tell me why you're out so late? Where did you come from?" Caleb's shoulders tensed, and he seemed to curl even further into himself. "Nowhere," he mumbled, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Is there someone I can call for you? Your parent, maybe. A relative or friend?" Caleb shook his head slowly, still not looking up. "There's no one left," he whispered. The words carried such profound sadness that John felt his heart constrict. His eyes were drawn to the photograph in Caleb's hands. The paper was worn at the edges, as if it had been handled frequently. "That must be a special picture you're holding," he said gently, hoping to establish some connection with the boy. Caleb's fingers tightened around the photo, immediately turning slightly away, making it clear he wasn't ready to share this piece of himself. John noticed how the boy's lower lip trembled, though he was clearly trying hard to maintain his composure. "It's okay," John assured him quickly. "You don't have to show me if you don't want to. I just want to help make sure you're safe." The car fell quiet again, save for the steady purr of the engine. John watched as Caleb blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Something terrible had happened to this child. That much was clear. The way he clutched that photo, his insistence that there was no one left, the deep sadness in his young eyes, it all pointed to a trauma that no child should have to bear. After a moment of consideration, John made his decision. He couldn't leave this boy alone, and a sterile shelter was no place for a child who had clearly been through so much already. "Caleb," he said softly, "I have a warm, safe home not far from here. Would you like to spend the night there? My wife Emma is a wonderful cook, and I'm sure she'd be happy to make you something to eat." Caleb finally looked up, meeting John's eyes in the rearview mirror. There was a flicker of hope in his expression, quickly masked by uncertainty and fear. "You'll be completely safe there," John assured him. "And tomorrow we can figure things out together. What do you say?" After what felt like an eternity, Caleb gave a tiny nod, his hands never loosening their grip on the photograph. John smiled warmly and put the car in drive. As they pulled away from the curb, he glanced once more in the rearview mirror. Caleb had turned to look out the window, the streetlights casting alternating patterns of light and shadow across his young face. John's home came into view, the porch light casting a warm glow across the front steps as they pulled into the driveway. Through the living room window, he could see Emma waiting up for him, her silhouette moving as she noticed the car's headlights. Turning to Caleb, who had somehow made himself appear even smaller in the back seat, John said softly, "We're here. That's my wife Emma at the window. She's very kind, and I promise you'll be safe with us." The front door opened, and Emma stepped onto the porch, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself against the cool night air. Her expression shifted from concern to gentle understanding as she saw Caleb climb hesitantly from the car, still clutching his photograph. "Hello there," Emma said, her voice warm and welcoming. "Please come inside where it's warm." Caleb followed John up the path, keeping a careful distance between himself and the adults as they entered the house. Emma's nurturing presence seemed to fill the space, and the tension in Caleb's shoulders eased slightly, though his guard remained firmly in place. "You must be cold," Emma said, reaching for a soft blanket draped over the back of the couch. "Here, wrap yourself in this. Would you like some hot cocoa? It always helps me feel better when I'm upset." Caleb nodded slightly, accepting the blanket with his free hand while keeping the photo close to his chest. Emma disappeared into the kitchen, and John gestured toward the comfortable living room sofa. "Have a seat, Caleb. You're safe here." Emma returned quickly with 3 mugs of cocoa, steam rising in delicate swirls. She placed them on the coffee table and sat in the armchair across from Caleb, who had settled into the corner of the sofa, the blanket pulled tight around his shoulders. "I'm Emma," she said gently. "I'm so glad John brought you here tonight. Would you like to tell us what happened?" Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. There was an accident. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the photo. 6 months ago, we were in the car, me and my parents. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, and she shared a heartbroken look with John. The weight of Caleb's words hung heavy in the air. It was raining, Caleb continued, his voice trembling. Really hard. The other car came so fast. His words trailed off as tears began rolling down his cheeks. He pulled the photograph closer, as if drawing strength from it. Emma moved to sit beside him on the sofa, careful to give him space. "You're very brave to share that with us, Caleb," she said softly. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." John leaned forward in his chair, his voice gentle but steady. "Where have you been staying since then?" Caleb's shoulders tensed again as he retreated into himself. His focus was entirely on the photograph. "They took me to Riverside Children's Home," he said quietly, his voice growing smaller. "I didn't have any other family." "They said." Emma leaned forward, her face full of compassion. "That must have been very hard for you." Caleb continued, his voice barely audible. "The first few days weren't so bad. I was just sad, really sad. But then," he paused, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Then things got worse." John noticed how Caleb's fingers tightened around the photograph, a lifeline in his turmoil. "What happened?" John asked softly, bracing himself for the boy's painful memories. "They locked me in the attic for 2 days," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. A heavy silence filled the room as the gravity of his words settled over them. Shadows of the past. Caleb's voice trembled as he recounted the horrors of his past, each word steeped in anguish. "They locked me in the attic for 2 days," he whispered, his eyes reflecting a depth of sadness that belied his young age. Emma's heart ached for the boy, her hand instinctively moving to comfort him on the couch. John sat forward, intent on every word, trying to understand the full extent of the trauma Caleb had endured. "It was so dark up there," Caleb continued, his hand shaking slightly as he spoke. "I screamed and banged on the door for hours. My throat hurt from yelling, but nobody came. I was up there for 2 whole days." His voice faltered, and he blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she placed a gentle hand on Caleb's shoulder, the gesture a silent offering of support. "You're safe now, Caleb," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "No one is going to hurt you like that again. I promise." The boy looked up at her, the flicker of hope in his eyes momentarily pushing back the shadows of fear. But the weight of his memories was heavy, and he continued, "When they finally let me out, I thought Mrs. Henderson would help me." But his voice trailed off, and his gaze fell back to the photograph in his lap, the last tangible connection to his parents. "What did she do?" John asked gently, encouraging him to share more. Caleb swallowed hard, a fresh wave of tears filling down his cheeks. "She said I must have done something bad to make the other kids lock me up there. She wouldn't let me have any food that day either. She said I needed to learn my lesson." His voice broke, and he buried his face in the blanket, shaking with silent sobs. John's heart ached at the realization of what this boy had suffered. The injustice of it clawed at him, and he felt a surge of anger toward the adults who had failed to protect Caleb. "Caleb, what Mrs. Henderson did was wrong. Very wrong. No child should ever be treated that way," he said, his voice firm yet kind. "I know," Caleb whispered, the words barely audible. "That's why I ran away. I couldn't stay there anymore." He looked up at John, fear crossing his face. "Please don't make me go back." Emma wiped the tears from her cheeks, her heart breaking for the child. "No one is going to make you go back there, sweetheart. Not ever," she said, her voice resolute. John nodded in agreement, feeling the weight of his promise. "You're safe here, Caleb. What happened to you wasn't right, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." Caleb's shoulders slumped, the tension slowly ebbing away as he felt the warmth of their support. For the first time since they had met, his grip on the photograph loosened slightly, as if the weight of his secrets had finally begun to lift. As night settled in, Caleb's soft breathing could be heard from the guest room, where he had finally succumbed to exhaustion. In the living room, John and Emma sat close. John nodded, pulling out the photograph Caleb had shown him earlier. The image captured a tender moment. Caleb's parents, smiling at each other in the front seat of their car, completely unaware of the tragedy that would soon unfold. But in the background, partially obscured by the car window, was the outline of a woman's face behind the wheel of another car. John's brow furrowed as he studied it, the unsettling feeling growing stronger. "Look at this car," John said, pointing to the reflection in the window. "It's definitely high-end. The grille design, the hood ornament. It looks like a luxury model." Emma leaned in closer, squinting at the details John indicated. "Can you tell what kind it is?" "Not exactly," John replied, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But there aren't many cars like this in our area. The design is unique." John's jaw tightened as he examined the blurry figure behind the wheel. There was something familiar about it, something that sent chills down his spine. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Caleb," he murmured, glancing back at the boy's sleeping form. Emma looked at him, worry etched across her features. "What are you thinking?" "I'm going to look into everything about what happened that day," John said firmly, his determination growing stronger. "But we have to be careful. I don't want to scare Caleb more than he already is." "Right," Emma said softly, concern mingling with resolve. "Let's focus on making him feel secure first. That's what he needs right now." John nodded, placing the photograph carefully back into his pocket. The next morning, he decided to visit the orphanage where Mrs. Henderson worked. He wanted to see for himself if the conditions were as bad as Caleb had described. The drive to Riverside Children's Home took 20 minutes, and as John approached the dreary three-story structure, a sense of dread settled in his stomach. The building loomed before him with peeling paint and rusty gutters, dead leaves scattered across the unkempt lawn. Several windows were covered with aged newspapers instead of curtains, creating a facade of neglect that made his heart ache for the children inside. Once inside, the air felt stale and cold. A receptionist directed John to the warden's office, where Mrs. Henderson sat behind a cluttered desk. She was a heavy-set woman with small, calculating eyes and thin lips pressed into a permanent frown. "Officer Matthews," Mrs. Henderson said, barely glancing up. "What brings you here?" "I'm here about a child who ran away from here," John stated firmly, meeting her gaze with determination. "Caleb Thompson. He told me about his treatment here." Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened, and John noticed the dismissive flicker in her eyes. "That black naughty kid ran away, didn't he? Typical." John's fingers curled into fists at his sides, trying to keep his composure. "You mean the 8-year-old boy you locked in an attic for 2 days? How could you think that's acceptable treatment?" Her smug smile faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "He was disciplined appropriately. That boy needed a firm hand. Always causing problems, that one." John felt anger rising within him. He was grieving his parents. He needed support, not cruelty. Cruelty. Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "Always playing that card, aren't they?" The boy was trouble, plain and simple. He didn't fit in here. "Didn't fit in," John echoed incredulously. "You mean you didn't want him to fit in? That's the problem." Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms defiantly. "Some children just aren't cut out for certain environments." With a tight jaw, John maintained eye contact. "He deserves better. I'll be watching this place very closely from now on. Every complaint, every incident report. I'll be paying attention. Is that supposed to frighten me, officer?" She shot back, her smile never reaching her eyes. "It should," John replied evenly. "Because Caleb deserves better, and I'm going to make sure every child who comes through here gets better." As he turned to leave, he could feel the bitterness radiating from her, but he refused to let it affect him. He needed to focus on Caleb and his well-being. Back at home, John found Emma in the kitchen, preparing dinner. When she saw his expression, her brows knitted together in concern. "Did you find anything?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Nothing solid," John said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Just the same old prejudices and cruelty. I'm worried about what's happening to those kids." Emma's eyes softened, filled with empathy. "We have to focus on Caleb first. He needs us." "I know," That night, as they settled in, John's thoughts raced. He knew they had to keep Caleb safe, but the unresolved questions gnawed at him. What truly happened on that rainy day? Who was the mysterious woman behind the wheel? And how could he protect Caleb from the harsh realities that had scared him? Sleep came fitfully, and as dawn broke, John's resolve solidified. He would not rest until he uncovered the truth, for Caleb's sake and for the sake of every child who deserved love and protection. The investigation begins. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the table where John sat with his coffee. Emma moved about, preparing breakfast, but John's thoughts were still tangled in the events of the previous night. He kept glancing toward the guest room, where Caleb slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil swirling around him. "John," Emma said softly, breaking his reverie as she placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. "What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath, setting his mug down. "I just can't shake this feeling that there's more to Caleb's story than we know. I need to find out what really happened to his parents. That accident, it can't just be a random tragedy." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. But we also need to be careful not to overwhelm him. He's been through so much already." "Of course," John replied, running a hand through his hair. "I just want to make sure he feels safe here first. But I also need to dig deeper into that accident. If there's any chance it was more than just a freak occurrence, I have to know." After breakfast, John decided to begin his investigation by revisiting the accident scene. He thought it would be helpful to familiarize himself with the area where the tragedy had occurred, hoping to find any details that could lead to answers. He grabbed his notebook, jotted down a few notes, and kissed Emma goodbye before heading out. As he drove through the neighborhoods, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose building within him. The streets felt familiar, but with each passing mile, he felt the weight of Caleb's story pressing on his shoulders. The accident site was a short drive away, located on a main road that wound through the outskirts of town, bordered by tall trees that shielded the area from the surrounding homes. When he arrived, John parked his patrol car on the shoulder and stepped out, the morning air crisp and invigorating. The road was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded there 6 months ago. As he walked toward the intersection where the accident occurred, John's mind replayed the details Caleb had shared, his family laughing together, the sound of rain, the rush of an oncoming car. He stood at the intersection, studying the road. It was slightly sloped, and he could see how rain-soaked pavement might lead to reduced visibility. Still, there was something about Caleb's account that nagged at him, a feeling that the story didn't add up. John glanced at the nearby trees lining the road, their leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. Then, his eyes caught sight of something shiny in the grass, an old, crumpled piece of metal. He knelt down and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It looked like part of a car, a detail that could be important in piecing together the past. He carefully tucked it into his pocket, determined to have it analyzed later. After examining the scene for a while, John decided to talk to any nearby residents who might have seen the accident. He approached a house that was situated just a few yards away from the intersection. The lawn was neatly kept, and the white picket fence gave it an inviting look. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a woman in her late 50s opened it, her expression curious. "Hello, Mom," John said, introducing himself. "I'm Officer Matthews. I'm investigating a car accident that occurred here about 6 months ago. I was wondering if you happened to see anything that day." The woman frowned, her brows knitting together in thought. "Oh, that day was dreadful. It was pouring rain, and I remember hearing a loud crash. I ran to the window but didn't see much, just the aftermath. A couple of emergency vehicles showed up quickly." "Did you see any other cars involved?" John pressed, hoping for any detail that could help him piece things together. "No, I didn't," she replied, shaking her head. "But I remember the sound of the sirens. It's not something you forget easily." John thanked her for her time and moved on to the next house. He continued down the street, talking to a few more neighbors, but none had witnessed the act. Next, he decided to visit the local DMV to see if there were any records of the cars registered in the area that matched the description from Caleb's photograph. The building was a nondescript concrete structure, typical of government offices. He entered, greeted the receptionist, and explained his inquiry. "Sure, officer," the receptionist said, tapping away at her computer. "What specific information do you need?" John outlined the details of the luxury car he had in mind, hoping for a hit. After a few minutes of searching, she looked up, her expression changing. "There are 3 registered vehicles that match that description. However, I can't give you the owner information unless it's a case involving an active investigation." Frustration bubbled within him, but he managed to keep his composure. "I am conducting an investigation. Is there any way you can provide me with the information? It's crucial to my case." The receptionist hesitated but then nodded. "Okay, I'll make an exception this time. Just give me a moment." John watched her as she typed, feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. A few moments later, she printed a sheet of paper and handed it to him. "Here you go, officer. These are the 3 vehicles registered in the last year. If you need further assistance, feel free to reach out." "Thank you," John said, taking the paper and scanning the names and addresses listed. His heart raced as he saw the familiar name of one of the owners. "I know this person. This could lead somewhere." He left the DMV, mind racing with possibilities. He had a name, an address, and a renewed sense of determination. Driving back home, John thought about Caleb and how important it was to uncover the truth for him. He couldn't allow another child to suffer the way Caleb had. Once back home, he found Emma in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked up, her expression softening as he entered. "Did you find anything?" "Yes," John replied, a hint of excitement in his voice. "I've got 3 leads, 3 registered vehicles that match the description of the one from Caleb's photograph." Emma's eyes widened with interest. "That's fantastic. What do you plan to do next?" "I want to follow up on these addresses," he said, pulling the paper from his pocket and handing it to her. "The first one is a familiar name, someone I've come across in the past. I think they might know something about the accident." Emma studied the names on the paper, her brow furrowing in thought. "Be careful, John. We don't know what kind of people we're dealing with." "I will be," he promised, feeling the weight of her concern. "I just want to get to the bottom of this for Caleb." As the evening wore on, John and Emma spent time together in their living room, the television softly playing in the background. Caleb had finally woken from his deep sleep and joined them, still holding the photograph tightly to his chest. Emma greeted him with a warm smile, while John watched, his heart swelling with affection for the boy. "Did you sleep well?" Emma asked gently, her voice soothing. Caleb nodded, still looking a bit unsure but comforted by the warmth of their presence. "Can I have some more cocoa?" he asked shyly, glancing toward the kitchen. "Of course," Emma replied, moving to refill his mug. Caleb took his seat on the couch, settling in and allowing himself to relax for the first time since John had found him. John watched the boy for a moment, noting the way the photograph seemed to anchor him, a piece of his past that held both joy and pain. "Caleb," John began carefully, "if you feel comfortable, I'd like to talk a bit more about your parents. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I want to make sure you're okay." Caleb's gaze dropped to the photo in his lap, and he hesitated. "Okay," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. John exchanged a glance with Emma, who nodded encouragingly. "You're safe here, Caleb. We just want to understand what you went through so we can help you." After a moment of silence, Caleb took a deep breath. "My mom and dad were really nice," he started, his voice trembling slightly. "They always made me laugh. We went to the park every Saturday. They let me take my camera, and I would take pictures of everything." A fond smile spread across Caleb's face as he spoke of his parents, and John felt a surge of warmth in his chest. "That sounds wonderful," he encouraged. "What kind of things did you like to photograph?" "Everything," Caleb replied, his enthusiasm returning momentarily. "The flowers, the ducks in the pond. I even took a picture of the ice cream truck once." "What happened that day?" John asked gently, his voice low and steady. Caleb's smile faded, replaced by a shadow of sadness. "It was raining really hard. We were on our way home from the park, and I wanted to take a picture of the raindrops on the window." His voice caught, and John leaned in, encouraging him to continue. "And then, there was another car coming. I remember my mom screaming." Tears filled Caleb's eyes as he recounted the memory, and Emma moved closer, wrapping an arm around him. "It's okay, Caleb," she whispered softly, rubbing his back gently. "I was so scared," he continued, his voice trembling. "I thought we would be okay. But then everything went black." John felt a lump in his throat as he watched Caleb relive the moment. "What happened after that?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. "I woke up in a hospital," Caleb said, his voice barely audible. "They told me my mom and dad were gone. I didn't understand. I thought they were just sleeping." John felt the weight of Caleb's grief pressing down on him, a stark reminder of the pain the boy had endured. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," he said, his heart breaking for the child. "You've been so brave." Caleb wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I just want to remember them," he said softly, clutching the photograph tightly once more. "I don't want to forget." "You won't forget," Emma assured him, her voice filled with warmth. "We'll always remember them with you, and we're here for you now." As the evening wore on, John realized the importance of keeping Caleb's memories alive, of honoring his parents, while also helping him heal. He glanced at Emma, who was nodding in agreement. Together, they would protect Caleb, giving him the love and support he so desperately needed. With renewed determination, John prepared to follow up on the leads he had gathered, knowing that every step he took was not just for himself, but for the child who had captured his heart. Caleb was safe now, and John would do everything in his power to ensure he stayed that way, uncovering the truth behind the shadows of the past that loomed over him. The chase for truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a golden hue, John Matthews felt a surge of urgency pulse through him. The cozy warmth of his home, filled with laughter and the aroma of Emma's cooking, stood in stark contrast to the storm brewing in his mind. He couldn't ignore the haunting memories Caleb had shared, nor the growing conviction that uncovering the truth behind the boy's past was imperative. After a long evening filled with stories and laughter, Caleb had retired to the guest room, still clutching the precious photograph that connected him to his parents. Emma had gone to check on him, leaving John to ponder the leads he had gathered earlier that day. He knew he needed to act quickly to prevent the shadows of the past from looming too long over Caleb's future. The following morning, John made a plan to visit the addresses of the registered vehicles associated with the accident. The first name on his list was one he had encountered before, Harold Wilson. A respected member of the community, Harold had a reputation for being philanthropic, yet John couldn't shake the feeling that there was more lurking beneath the surface. "Be careful, John," Emma had said when he shared his plans over breakfast. "We don't know what we're dealing with, especially if it involves the accident." "I will," John assured her, feeling the weight of her concern. "But I have to follow this lead. For Caleb." With that resolve in mind, John set out, driving through the familiar streets that led him to Harold Wilson's upscale neighborhood. The houses were grand, with manicured lawns and well-kept gardens, embodying a lifestyle that felt distant from Caleb's recent experience. As he approached Harold's residence, he noticed the sleek luxury car parked in the driveway, the same model he had seen in Caleb's photograph. John parked across the street, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. He understood that confronting Harold would be delicate. The man was known for his charm and charisma, but John was determined to see past that facade. He stepped out of his patrol car and walked up to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He rang the doorbell, and a moment later, Harold appeared, his expression shifting from surprise to a cautious smile. "Officer Matthews, to what do I owe this visit?" "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," John replied, keeping his tone professional. "I'm here to ask you a few questions regarding the accident that took place 6 months ago." As John crossed the threshold, he took in the elegance of the interior, ornate furnishings, family photos adorning the walls, and a scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. It all felt so starkly different from the life Caleb had described. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" Harold asked, leading John into a comfortable sitting room. "No, thank you," John replied, settling into an armchair, his gaze steady on Harold. "I'd prefer to get straight to the point. Can you tell me about the day of the accident? What you remember?" Harold hesitated, his brow furrowing as he searched for the right words. "It was a rainy day, as you know. My wife and I were driving home from visiting some friends. I remember the sound of the rain against the windshield, how it made the visibility poor." John nodded, noting the man's careful choice of words. "Did you see any other vehicles involved? Perhaps a family in a black car?" The question seemed to catch Harold off guard. He glanced away, his fingers fidgeting slightly. "No, I didn't see anything unusual, just the rain and our car. I assure you, officer, it was a terrible accident, but I can't recall any specifics." "Not even if you were driving in a hurry?" John pressed gently, watching the man closely for any signs of evasion. "Absolutely not. We were driving normally, just like anyone else," Harold replied, his voice firm. "I truly have no idea what happened." John felt a surge of frustration. The man's demeanor suggested he was hiding something, but John couldn't press too hard without concrete evidence. "I understand this might be difficult to discuss," he said, attempting to keep the conversation open. "But a young boy lost his parents that day. Any information you have could help him heal." At the mention of Caleb, Harold's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. "A tragic situation indeed," he said, his tone almost too measured. "But I really can't provide any more insight into that day." John studied Harold, recognizing the defensive wall he had built around himself. "If you think of anything, please don't hesitate to reach out," he said, standing up to leave. "And I hope you'll remember that the boy deserves to know the truth." As John exited the house, he felt an unsettling mix of anger and disappointment. Harold's reluctance to share details only deepened the mystery surrounding the accident. But John was determined not to give up. He had 2 more addresses to follow up on, and he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. The next address led John to a well-kept suburban home, where an elderly couple welcomed him with curiosity. The woman, Mrs. Henderson, greeted him at the door, her face warm but cautious. "What can I do for you, officer?" "I'm investigating the accident involving a young boy and his parents," John explained, maintaining a friendly demeanor. "I was hoping you could share what you remember about that day." "Oh dear, yes. It was a dreadful storm, wasn't it?" she replied, a frown creasing her forehead. "I remember it well. We were having tea when we heard the crash. My husband rushed to the window, and we both saw the emergency vehicles arrive. Did you see anything else? Perhaps a car you recognized?" John prompted. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "I didn't see much, just flashes of lights in the rain. We didn't think much of it at the time." As she spoke, John noticed the nervous glances exchanged between the couple. Something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Did you know the family involved?" he asked, his tone careful. "I didn't know," she replied quickly. "Just a terrible tragedy." John sensed that the couple was holding back, but he also didn't want to push too hard. "If you happen to remember anything else, please let me know. It's important for the boy's sake," he said, leaving them with a cordial farewell. As John made his way to the last address, a nagging feeling tugged at him. Both Harold Wilson and the Hendersons seemed to skirt around the truth, as if they were protecting something. He parked in front of the final house, which looked similar to the others, a well-maintained property with a neatly trimmed lawn. As he approached the door, he took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever might lie ahead. When the door opened, a middle-aged woman with auburn hair. "I didn't see the accident itself," she replied, shaking her head. "But I remember seeing a black car on the side of the road afterward. It looked like it had been hit hard." John's heart raced as he leaned in, desperate for more information. "Do you remember anything about the other vehicle? The one that was involved?" The woman paused, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. "I think it was a luxury model, but I couldn't tell you much more. I was too busy worrying about the people involved. It was such a chaotic scene." "What about any people at the scene?" John pressed gently. "Did you notice anyone acting strangely?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I didn't see anyone acting suspiciously, but there were a lot of emergency responders there. It was overwhelming." John thanked her for her time and left, feeling the frustration of a long day weighing heavily on him. The leads had brought him little closer to the truth, but he remained determined to uncover what had happened to Caleb's parents. As he drove back home, John replayed the conversations in his mind, piecing together fragments of information. He knew he needed to go deeper, to connect the dots between Caleb's memories and the adults who had witnessed the tragedy. He was sure that the pieces of the puzzle were all there, waiting for him to discover them. When he arrived home, he found Emma in the living room, talking quietly with Caleb. The boy looked up as John entered, his eyes shining with trust and vulnerability. "Did you find anything?" Caleb asked, his voice hopeful. "Not yet, but I'm working on it," John replied, kneeling down to meet Caleb's gaze. "I promise I won't stop until I uncover the truth." Caleb nodded, clutching the photograph a little tighter. "I want to know what really happened," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions behind